Hey everyone, this is Kendall from the Recording Lounge podcast, and today I'm talking about checking phase on drums. Now, if you haven't checked out my video on phase versus polarity, I highly recommend you go do that. It will explain a lot of this stuff and sort of the inner workings of why this happens, but we're going to talk about phase checking drums. So when we're dealing with drums, in this particular instance, we've got quite a few channels. I've got a typical setup, stereo overhead, stereo room mics, mono rooms, kick, snare. I got kick in and out. I've got snare top and bottom. And I like this simple little drum groove in the verse because it uses every piece of the kit. It uses crashes, it uses all three toms, and it's just a really simple beat for us to check drums on. So the way that I like to start out by checking for phase on drums is to start with the kick inside mic. Now, barring any sort of unusual cabling mistakes, your kick inside mic should be correct. Like if you have a cable that's wired incorrectly or wired out of phase or wired, it's flipped, the hot pin and the waveform could end up backwards essentially, or upside down, or out of phase, or out of polarity, however you want to look at it. All of my cables I make sure and test with a cable tester. I highly recommend you do that and make sure that they are actually receiving the correct signal in phase. So I use my kick in as my reference. And you can even zoom in and see it here. I mean, when you hit this, this goes up and this goes down. But just visually, we can already see the kick outside mic, as soon as that hits, it goes down and then up. So there's a pretty good likelihood that these are actually canceling each other out. So let's just take a listen to what the drums sound like now. So not bad, right? They don't sound bad. They're recorded well. They're played well. It's a nice setup. But the problem is that, things can be deceiving, right? We can say, oh yeah, that sounds fine. But in reality, we haven't spent the time to properly go through and check the phase because you might actually be missing on it sounding way better. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to just record what we have now. So for the most part, this sounds pretty good to me, but we're just going to save this for now, and hopefully we can make it even better than this. So like I said, I like to start with the kick in. So you're going to take your reference point, and what this means is I'm not going to flip this mic, okay? I'm just going to leave this one as is. So we're going to take the kick in and the kick out. We're going to solo them up, and the big trick here is, number one, you want to try to listen in mono. That really helps. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a plug-in on my master bus that will allow me to narrow out my signal. Now, obviously, the kick in and out are already mono, but listening in mono helps a lot for phase issues. And the second trick is you want to make sure that the levels are relatively similar. So, for example, I wouldn't want to check phase like this. I want to check it like this. Okay, now what we do when we check phase generally on drums and on other things is we listen for whichever one sounds the fullest, because low frequencies have longer wavelengths, and that's the thing that's generally going to cancel the easiest. So all it takes is my phase flip here, or my polarity flip, and what this is doing is essentially inverting the waveform. Now we do have variable phase tools, which I will talk about here in a little bit, but let's just take a listen and see what it sounds like flipping and comparing. Okay, so notice that not only when I flip this does it get louder, but it seems to have a little bit more punch. Now, at the same time, I'd like to point out, technically speaking, there's no right or wrong way to leave the phase. You can leave something flip phase if you feel like it really sounds better that way. But generally speaking, you're going to run into problems doing that. Like I mentioned, there are also variable phase plugins like the Voxengo here that I really like to vary the phase in between. So check this out. The other trick in checking phase is to flip the phase and then find the spot where it sounds the thinnest. That sounds pretty thin to me. Now, when you reverse the phase again, it should be, in theory, the thickest. If you find the thinnest spot and then you reverse the phase or reverse the polarity, then it should be the thickest spot. So let's hear that. So even though you might say, well, I kind of like the tone a little better before because you're hearing more click out of the kick drum. Well, part of that is that you're now hearing these waveforms combine, and you really just need to turn this kick out mic down more because you like the sound of this mic. So these are now in phase. So now that I've done this, I'll generally do the same thing to my snare top and bottom. So generally speaking, your snare mic, your snare top mic is probably going to be correct. Oh, much better that way. Hear how it gets thin and kind of hollow? Kind of boxy? And it just sounds right there, okay? 99% of the time, the bottom snare mic is going to have to be flipped. Any bottom mics, if you have a bottom mic on the tom or the bottom mic on a snare, and that's primarily because they're picking up the waveform essentially oppositely. So when you hit a snare head, the snare head presses down, which is going away from the snare top mic and towards the bottom mic. So next thing I do is I generally want to check my overheads against my snare. There's not generally a lot of kick in your overheads, so I often just use the snare. So I've got my snare. Now that I have flipped this and I've left these alone, you kind of put it out of your mind and it's like, okay, that's good now. I'm not going to touch it. So now, move to my overheads. Again, you want to try to make sure these are pretty close in level. Okay, so it's much better not flipped. Check out the low end on the snare and hear how it kind of hollows out when I flip it. It sounds much punchier that way, so I'm going to leave it that way. Now I can turn this back down. Now that I've got this, I'm going to check that against, say, my mono room. It sounds a little bit thicker to me, not flipped, but we'll also go down the line of checking our rooms to each other. So the next one I'm going to check out is my hi-hat mic. This is one a lot of people forget about, but the hi-hat mic does have some snare in it. Wow, that's actually pretty significant. Check that out. Listen to the snare. It has a little more low end when the hi-hat is flipped. Now again, a lot of times you're going to pull out the low end on your hi-hat like this. I know it, you know it, but regardless, it's still important to try to get the phase as good as possible before you even start mixing. And then if you need to readjust the phase as you go because you've EQ'd things weird or you've done some pretty big boosts or cuts, then you can do that later. But it's always a good thing to start with a good, clean slate. So I've got a couple more mics I need to check my snare with. This is a crush mic. Sounds a little better to me not flipped, but that might change later. And I've got, actually that's my OTK mic, and then here's my crush mic. Not really hearing a difference. I kind of like it a little better not flipped, but again, I'm going to check some of these other ones to each other. So I'm going to check my snare to my stereo room mics now. I I think I like it a little better not flipped. So now that I've gone through the majority of my microphones here, I'm going to check all of my sort of distant mics against each other. So I'm going to start with my overheads, and then I'm going to add in my rooms. Again, I'm trying to level match them pretty closely. So at this point, that's pretty subtle, so I might just have to wait until the context of the mix to decide, do I like it a little better flipped? Even if it does maybe thin out a little bit. Maybe I need to add in the kick to check that out. But let's check out mono room and stereo overhead. Definitely better not flipped, okay? And let's check out overheads and our OTK mic. Ooh, I kind of like that one a little better flipped. So I might actually, because this one I remember being like, I don't really hear a huge difference. Yeah, I think I like it a little better flipped. Okay, let's check out our overheads with our crush mic. Not a huge difference there, so I'm just going to leave it unflipped. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and check my kick against my room mic. So here's kick and mono room. I like it a little better flipped, I think, but not a whole lot. It definitely sounded better when it was not flipped with the snare and the overhead, so I'm going to leave that as is. And kick with stereo rooms. It has a little bit more low end to me when it's flipped, so I'm going to leave it that way. I often find that your snare and your overheads are generally going to be a pretty good match for each other, and your kick and your room mics will generally have something to say too. I'm going to check my kick with my OTK mic. Much better flipped, okay? So check out the low end loss when it's not flipped. A lot of this big fat low end comes back. Okay, there's probably not going to be much kick in my hi-hat mic, and if so, I'm going to roll that off anyway for sure. So next thing, we got to check our... Oh, and I'll check the crush mic just for good measure. Not a huge opinion on that one. It maybe sounds a little better this way. I'm not really sure. Again, sometimes you're not going to hear a big difference, especially because in this case, like the crush mic, hardly has any kick anyway. It's got like click and some mid-range, but it doesn't really have a lot of kick low end. So now that we have this, we're going to check out our toms. So I like to solo up my toms. Let's go to my rack tom first. And check that against overheads. And now, again, because I've gone through the process of kick, snare, and overheads and rooms, and I know those are all solid, I'm not going to flip my overheads now. I'm going to flip my rack tom if it needs it. So I'm trying to match the level of the rack tom close mic to the rack tom peak in the stereo overhead. It sounds a little better to me not flipped, so I'm going to leave it not flipped. Now let's check out our floor A. So this is like a 14-inch floor tom. Sounds a little fuller to me, flipped, so I'm going to leave it flipped. And our big floor tom, which is I think 16. And let's flip it. I think I like it a little better not flipped. It's hard to tell on that one. Floor toms are always a little bit hard to hear sometimes, it seems like. So let's check them out in the stereo rooms. Sometimes they come across a little bit better in the stereo rooms. Ooh, I actually might like it a little better flipped. Now, I want to mention also, because of the way that we place so many microphones on a drum kit, sometimes you'll end up with a snare that sounds better with a flipped room mic, but a floor tom that sounds better with an unflipped room mic. And that really sucks, okay? There's not a whole lot you can do about that. Obviously, you can sort of refine your mic position on the way in, but that's something that can be really hard to detect when you're just monitoring, while someone's playing drums, and it can be really difficult to find that stuff on the way in. Instead, you find it later when you're mixing something. So in this case, I would probably make a decision of how roomy are these drums going to be. Are the stereo room mics going to be really important in this drum sound, or is it going to be more about the close mics? Well, in this particular case, I'd say, it's probably going to be more about the overheads. So does it sound good with the overheads? I think I might leave it flipped because it sounded better that way with the rooms. And it sounds better that way to me with the overheads. Let's check mono room. Not a huge difference. Let's check our OTK mic with all of our toms. Definitely better flipped. And not huge opinion there. And rack tom. Yep, definitely better not flipped. So this is all working out pretty well. And the crush mic is going to have some floor tom in it too because it's down near that area. So let's check out the crush mic with the big floor tom. Well, how about the other floor tom? See if we get any info there. Okay. See how the crush mic actually cancels out quite a bit of the low end on that floor tom? So I'm going to leave the crush mic flipped because, again, it sounded pretty much fine with the snare. We can double check. Right? Not a huge change there. So I'm going to prioritize the floor tom in that situation and use the crush mic flipped. So now that we've gotten all of these, let's check out our whole drum sound. I'm just going to turn down this stuff and kind of bring things back to where they were. Let's record this sound just so we can hear it all together. So now let's compare before our phase check and after our phase check. Now that we've done this, I know the balance is going to be slightly different, but that's a little unavoidable in this case. But let's check these out. Let's just turn them down and make sure they're not going to clip. But you can already see, look at this. You can see, I'm just going to go and render these. You can see how the peaks are actually higher here because they're not canceling as much. So check out the difference. Here's before. After, before, after, to me, the kick sounds a lot clearer and punchier. The snare sounds better. Obviously, again, the balance isn't identical, but to me, I feel so much better about that. It sounds much punchier and much clearer, much tighter. You're never going to get the phase perfect between every single channel. It's much easier the fewer mics you have. If you're doing a drum sound with, say, 4 microphones, it's a lot easier. I always check the phase on every single channel, just like I described it here, because you can sort of uncover like all this low end that maybe you lost. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, go check out my podcast at recordingloungepodcast.com. Make sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and check out the podcast on your favorite app or website.